Well, hey, everybody, welcome to Cornerstone Community Church online. My name is Kyle. I'm the pastor here, and we're kicking off a brand new series of conversations that we're calling The Problem of God. I want to tell you my story as we talk about this idea, the problem of science. Can you have belief in God and also belief in science at the same time? I'm a little bit afraid that you're going to think that I'm just that church kid who grew up believing everything that he's saying right now and following a script. But I want you to hear something today that I've really wrestled with this topic in particular. You know, I did grow up attending church, but I attended church in a way that, it was just what you did on Sundays. It didn't really impact my life and the decisions that I made, at least not until I was in university, where I was attending a secular university studying biological chemistry when I really gave my life to Jesus. I remember quite vividly the debates that would be staged on campus about the existence of God. And they were always framed as us versus them, right? Like the intellectuals versus the brainwashed, the noted evolutionary biologist versus the guy who homeschooled his 8 kids. But for me, it was more than that because I identified with both teams. And I was left wondering what I had right and what I had wrong because you couldn't possibly be both. Science and religion, or science and faith in God, were two mutually exclusive, incompatible ideas. This was and still is the popular understanding among most people that you can't have both. You know, in preparation for today, we shared some Instagram and Facebook stories asking that question. Can you have faith in science and faith in God? And immediately the no's began to roll in. Well, 2 years ago, a large Canadian church just outside of the GTA surveyed its community. And I'm not talking about the people in the church that are Christians already. I mean, like the people in the GTA, asking them the top 5 reasons they don't believe in God. And it's some really good answers, and we're going to talk about really all of them this summer. One was the problem of evil and suffering. I mean, how can you believe in a loving God if terrible things are happening in the world? We're going to talk about that this summer. Another one was the problem of sexuality. And when you think about it, it's really not a belief issue. It's a matter of submission and obedience. I mean, can I really follow this guy named Jesus if he said what the Bible says about sexuality? How do I do that? We're going to have that conversation. But neither of those were the number one reason that people shared that they didn't believe that they could believe in a religious power or a Christian God. The number one reason people thought that their religious beliefs were incompatible with scientific beliefs. Now, why is that? Well, this is not a new idea. It's actually a widely held thought system called secularism. It's not brand new to us. It's held a lot of sway and influence since the Enlightenment, and it teaches that there is no God and there is no spiritual reality beyond what you can test. It says that beliefs in the untestable spiritual realm, according to secularism, have been uncategorically proven false and should be dismissed. You see this idea really represented today with a group of scientists called the New Atheists. You know, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens. They say that science and evolution have provided enough evidence to arrive at atheistic and naturalistic conclusions to all of the foundational questions of life. Our origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. And they say that anyone who disagrees with them is primitive or irrational. Richard Dawkins puts it this way. He says that faith is like a mental illness, a great cop-out, the excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Sam Harris puts it a little bit more harshly. He says that we have names for many who have beliefs for which there is no rational justification. When their beliefs are extremely common, we call them religious. Otherwise, they are likely to be called mad, delusional, or psychotic. Listen, according to secularism, science is about thinking, evidence, and reason. And I agree with them that at its heart, that's what science is about. But it also says that faith in a Christian God, or any God for that matter, is founded upon evading evidence and non-rationality. Listen, if they are correct that faith in God requires you to shut down your brain and dismiss your mental faculties, no wonder this is the number one reason people say they can't believe in God. Now look, here is my issue. If the Christian understanding of faith and science requires me to shut down my brain and behave like a, blind, mindless lemming, I find that to be incompatible with the teachings of Jesus. Asked by a group of religious leaders, Jesus was asked, what is the most important commandment in the Jewish law? Of all of the rules that we are supposed to be following, the hundreds, what is the one that we should be doing? And you can read Jesus' response in Mark chapter 12. He says this, that the most important thing is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and with all your strength. Jesus, who is the center of the Christian faith, says that the most important thing is to love God, and that includes loving him with your mind, with your intellect. He's saying that he's not looking for people to be blindly devoted, but instead adding their intellect to their affection. This means that if faith and science are at odds, it seems to me that faith in Jesus is at odds with the teaching of Jesus. And that really is a problem of God. Now, my goal here is not to tell you what to think or believe. You're going to decide that for yourself. But instead, I want to share with you what I believe and why, and invite you to question your questions and doubt your doubts and follow the evidence wherever it goes. And I'll commit to doing the same thing as well. Because what I believe is that fact-based science is not at odds with faith-based religion. Science shouldn't kill your theological curiosity, it should spark it. And you should know that because we do live in a world of extremism and sound bites that would love for you to write off God because you believe in science, or write off science because you believe in God. But this isn't where the evidence leads us. The evidence leads more and more to religious faith, specifically in a Christian God, being not the less reasonable conclusion, but the more reasonable conclusion. A philosopher, David Bentley Hart, says this, I do not regard true philosophical atheism as an intellectually valid or even cogent position. In fact, I see it as a fundamentally irrational view of reality, which can be sustained only by a tragic absence of curiosity or a fervently resolute will to believe the absurd. The case for belief in God is inductively so much stronger than the case for unbelief that true philosophical atheism must be regarded as a superstition. David Bentley Hart here is addressing a couple of myths, and the first thing that you need to know of why he comes to this conclusion is that everyone has a faith position. For the religious, it's obvious we have a faith position, but for you, the atheist or the agnostic that's watching at home right now, you say, I don't have faith because I'm a naturalist. I only believe what is observable, and faith is for the weak-minded. The celebrity Ricky Gervais says that atheism is not a belief system, but he's wrong. The definition of faith is complete trust in someone or something. So, when you say that I don't need faith, I have evidence, by definition, you are admitting faith. That is belief, trust, and confidence in evidence. Listen, you're not wrong to have faith and confidence in evidence, but you're wrong if you say that you don't have faith, because it is faith. You need to understand that everyone, the atheist, the agnostic, and the Christian, views the world through a particular lens or grid, that we all have a worldview that is based upon faith. Now, your faith can come from a myriad of different sources, your upbringing and your parents and where you live and your circumstances and the media that you consume. And you may not even be aware of your faith position. But every human being reaches some sort of faith-based conclusion for which there is no empirical observable proof. Let me give you an example. It wasn't too long ago that I was involved in a funeral for a family member. My wife's brother died at a very young age, and I got to tell you that at least for most of his life, he was not a church person. And the people that he spent his time with also were not church people. And if you catch my drift, his lifestyle certainly would not have indicated to you that he would have practiced the teachings of Jesus. He and many of his friends indicated that they had no faith, that they were atheists or agnostics. But when he died, I remember standing in that receiving line with my wife, and everybody's coming and issuing their condolences. Over and over and over again, we hear from his friends that say they don't have faith. At least he's in a better place. At least he's not suffering anymore. And my question for you is, how do you know that? Because these are metaphysical statements about what the afterlife is like, for which there is no physical evidence. That is a faith position. Now listen, there is a problem, okay? We are blind to our own blindness, and that is true in science as well. Richard Lewontin, a university biologist at Harvard, wrote an article that he and his colleagues prefer naturalistic, atheistic explanations for everything they study. And this isn't a surprise, right? Like, we could have guessed that that was going to happen. But what he says next, the reason for their preference, is shocking. He says, we have a prior commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by a priori adherence to material causes, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. I mean, do you hear that? That is scary. What drives his science is not facts, but philosophy. That his faith position of atheism determines his science. It's not his science that determines his faith. It's why it was so shocking in my second year of university when my analytical chemistry professor would end every class with a question that challenged the status quo. I remember the first question he asked us. If it took millions of years for RNA and mRNA to develop from DNA, and they're both required in the process of cell division, how did the first cells divide? Class dismissed. It challenged our faith positions, and that's why it was so shocking. I want to address for just a moment the myth of church versus science. Because there's this idea that the church or faith in God have for generations been anti-science. But I got to tell you the truth that actually faith and the church never have been anti-science. Sure, there have been disputes, of course, and the results of those are often greatly exaggerated. And yes, there are individuals who identify as faith-filled individuals who will stand on the soapbox and certainly preach things that aren't supported by science. But overall, the church is not anti-science. I want to give you a couple examples. That Copernicus, he was the one that suggested that actually it's not the sun that travels around the earth, but it's the earth that travels around the sun. It wasn't the church that said we don't like this teaching. It was the scientific community that tried to suppress it. Why? Because it came up against their generations of teaching, that it didn't fit their agenda, and so he faced persecution from the scientific community and not the church. Another example that we'll talk about maybe a little bit more next week is the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory was not rejected by the church. It was actually pushed back upon by the scientific community. Because the scientific community had always held the idea that the universe was eternal. There is no beginning, there is no end, it's just permanent middle. And the church saw this and they said, you know what, this doesn't actually pose that much of a threat to what we teach, because we have been teaching for ages that the world, that the earth, that the universe had a beginning. And so it was the scientific community, not the church, that tried to suppress it. There's an Oxford professor named Alistair McGrath, and he said that the idea that science and religion are in perpetual conflict is no longer taken seriously by any major historian of science. one of the last remaining bastions of atheism which survives only at the popular level, namely the myth that an atheistic, fact-based science is permanently at war with a faith-based religion. There was a survey in 2009 among scientists that belonged to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And it was polling them to see how many of them believed in some sort of higher power. And in fact, 51% of scientists within the hard sciences, that's, cosmology and biology and physics and chemistry, 51% of them said that they believed in some sort of universal spirit or higher power. And 31% of those scientists said that they believe in a personal God. I want to give you one example. Francis Collins. He's a famous geneticist who is known for his work on the Human Genome Project, mapping strands of DNA. And because of his scientific research, he came to faith in God. He said that the code contained in the DNA could not with reason be an accident. And so his conclusion was that someone or something must have designed it. Fact-based science is not at odds with faith-based religion. And the truth is that science has come to terms with the fact that nothing it deduces about reality can disprove the existence of God. Science studies the natural world, but the problem or question of God is a supernatural question. Science is physical and God is metaphysical, meaning beyond physical. And so you can't use science to disprove the existence of God. Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould, the most celebrated atheist, evolutionary biologist, paleontologist, and historian of science in the last generation, argues just that. He says nature just is, in all her complexity and diversity, in all her sublime indifferences to our desires. Therefore, we cannot use nature for our moral instruction, for answering any question within the magisterium of religion. To say it for my colleagues and for the umpteenth millionth time, science simply cannot, by its legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. We simply cannot comment on it as scientists. Instead, he argues for what he's called the NOMA principle. He says that science and the question of God's existence are NOMA. They're non-overlapping magisterial authorities. You can't use physics to prove that a metaphysical being exists or doesn't exist. But it could, as many have suggested, like Francis Collins, give us evidence that he does exist. Let's just land now on the reason that many agnostics and scientists don't believe in a Christian God, and it's the Christian creation story. You can read it in Genesis chapter 1. It says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, the first day." And you read that and you say to yourself, well, anything else you had to say today may have been somewhat convincing, but that right there is the reason that I cannot jump on board. Can I tell you about the word, the original language that this was written in? If we were to look at that word day, in the Hebrew, it's the word yom. Now, among very reputable, conservative Christians, there is a little bit of contention as to how to define that word day, because not unlike English, it has multiple meanings. So yom can mean one calendar day. It can mean 24 hours, but it can also mean season or a metaphor, or it could be an epoch or an entire era. Now listen, I do believe that if God were to will it and desire it, that he could create the world in 6 or 7 days simply by speaking it. But I'm not saying that he didn't take more time than that. There are a small group of Christians that behave like this is the only issue that demands our attention. They say that you need to believe in a literal 6-day creation or you can't be a Christian. This isn't unlike many of those debates that I attended and listened to and tried to process as a young Christian and university student. But it's not true. The Bible is not built upon this point, nor does it collapse if the word yom or day means a season. What is the Bible built upon? It's the death and resurrection of Jesus, whom Richard Dawkins admits probably existed. Christians have disagreed on the interpretation of this word for ages, for generations, and still coexisted. Sincere, faithful Christians believe that the earth can be 6,000 years old all the way to 13 billion years old. Listen, my goal is not to prove myself right or to prove you wrong. My goal is to question our questions and ask questions that force every one of us to evaluate what we believe and why we believe it. So, what if, as we think about the problem of science and faith in God, that the question that we ask moves beyond how and becomes who and why? Science does answer the question of how. But as we've seen from science itself, it cannot answer the biggest, hardest questions of life. The genesis, the beginning, the morality, the meaning of life, and our destiny. These two ideas, science and faith, are NOMAs. They're non-overlapping magisterial authorities, and they do not disqualify one another, but they very well may support one another. So here's what I want you to do. Question your questions and doubt your doubts. If you are an atheist or agnostic watching today, because of the problem of science, ask yourself who and why. And I want you to do that because fact-based science is not at odds with faith-based religion. And when you're honest with yourself, it isn't an intellectually honest reason to dismiss Jesus. Science reveals the hand of God, and it reveals the heart of God. Thank you, Father. We love you so much. And we are encouraged by what it is that we see here in your word. I ask that by your Spirit that you would speak to everybody today, whether they believe in you already or not, that you would encourage them to evaluate their questions and their doubts and come to a reason to follow you, to say yes to you or to reject you based on the evidence, not just based on what we've heard. I ask, God, that you would move in a powerful way, that you would convince us of the truth, and we put our faith in you and say yes to you, Jesus. Amen.